Psychological safety is described as a belief that you can speak up with candor, ideas, questions, concerns, mistakes, without fear of punishment or humiliation. As long as there's a big gap between the thought bubbles and the stated words, that means low psychological safety. And that is a risk factor for an organization.
Amy Edmondson has changed how the world thinks about leadership. Her research on psychological safety has become the blueprint for building high-performing teams, where people speak up, take smart risks, and learn fast from failure. So in this episode, Amy shares how great leaders create trust without losing accountability, and why psychological safety isn't about comfort, but because it's about performance. So if you lead people, this conversation will upgrade how you lead, starting today.
Two giant risks. One type are the quality problems or failures that will happen because people didn't speak up in a timely way to help prevent them. The other big kind of failure is the failure to innovate. So when CEOs and others are hearing that psychological safety used as a concept in tension with high performance, they need to push back.
One of the misconceptions when it comes to psychological safety that is about being nice, is about being transparent and open and say good things about whatever is happening.
Being nice in vernacular terms is usually don't say what you really think because it wouldn't be nice. And that is perfectly fine at your next dinner party. But that's not what we do at work because too much is at stake.
We agree that safety can feel fragile. In terms of the fragility of safety, what do you think is the smartest way for leaders to rebuild psychological safety after it's been broken?
My answer is that.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of the World Class Leader Show. So I always say every day, I'm so honored and happy and glad to have guests with us. But this time, honestly, is different for me personally. And I'm sure it's going to be different for you too, because I'm so big fan of Amy Edmondson, and Amy is with us today. So Amy is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management of the Harvard Business School. It's chair established to support the study of human interactions that lead to the creation of successful enterprises that contribute to the betterment of society. Amy has been recognized, as most of you know, by the biannual Thinker 50 Global Ranking of Management Thinkers since 2011, and most recently was ranking number 1 in 21 and 2023. She also received the Organization Breakthrough Idea Award in 2019 and Talent Award in 2017. She studies teaming, psychological safety, as I'm sure you are aware of, and organizational learning. And her articles have been published in numerous academic and management outlets, including Administrative Science Quarterly, Academy of Management Journal, Harvard Business Review, and California Manager Review. Now, her 2019 book, The Fearless Organization, Creating Psychological Safety in the Workplace for Learning, Innovation, and Growth, has been translated into 15 languages. Amy's latest book, Right Kind of Wrong, builds on her prior work on psychological safety and teaming to provide a framework for thinking about discussing and practicing the science of failing well. First published in US and UK in September 2023, the book is due to be translated into 24 additional languages and was selected for the Financial Times and Schroeder's Best Business Book of the Year award. That was long, Amy, but was needed because it's well-deserved.
Too long, but thank you. It's delightful to be here.
Well, when somebody like you has such an incredible career, success, and results, I think it's worth mentioning all the great things that you have done, Amy. So before we start and going inside the topic of clearly you're very much famous about, psychological safety. Actually, I want to start with the why, because you're being called the world leading voice in psychological safety. And before it became, which I don't think it was your intention, by the way, but it became a global leadership word, buzzword, term, whatever you want to call it, what really drew you personally into this field? So was there a defining moment for you?
Maybe not. It depends on if the question is what drew me into this field, rather than how I somehow got connected with psychological safety. It was years and years ago. So I started my career as an engineer, and I drifted into a new role in organizational consulting in the late 80s. And I was absolutely intrigued, just, captivated by the work in a way that I never had been captivated to the same degree by the technical work. Why was it so captivating? I think I found the problem or the challenge of people and people in, collections trying to get things done to be endlessly fascinating. And so at first I was just rolling up my sleeves and, working for a tremendous mentor and getting many sort of implementation projects sorted out and working on implementing them. It dawned on me, I was a little bit of a slow learner, but it dawned on me, a couple of years into this work, that I really needed a better background. If I fell in love with this work, which I did, but I had no training, I had an engineering degree and a design degree, I needed to go back to school. And I didn't know much about what that meant. I was fortunate to meet a couple of sort of people in my type of role, Chris Argyris, Peter Senge at MIT, Chris at Harvard, and Ed Schein at MIT through the work we were doing. We would often bring thought leaders together. And they all looked at me and said it was sort of obvious. I needed to do a PhD, and I, had so little idea of what that would really mean. But I trusted them, I applied. I didn't know how I'd pay for it. I didn't realize that if you get in, you get paid to do it. I mean, it was a whole eye-opening journey for me, pre-internet, obviously. So I was pretty ignorant when I started. It has been a very good turn. It's been the problems that I try to think about and work on are just endlessly interesting to me. It's the problem of people and how can we work together in the most effective ways to accomplish important goals.
And when psychological safety became a thing for you, so when you realized that was something worth researching and studying and going deeper on.
So I was a first-year PhD student, and my stated interest, which is still my stated interest, was how do we help organizations learn? In a world that keeps changing, the organizations that learn, adapt, innovate, improve are the ones that will succeed. And yet, everything in my consulting experience had led me to the conclusion that organizational learning is hard. People are pretty good learners, but collectively, it's hard to change processes and activities and mindsets and beliefs. And so that was the problem I wanted to study. But how do you do that? It's a little too abstract and a little too big. So I was asked as a first-year PhD student to join a study this is almost just by accident, a big ambitious study of medication errors in hospitals. And I just thought, well, error, learning, yep, that works, right? I didn't really have all that many options, but I could make a direct connection between error and organizational learning. If there's anything I believed, it was that organizations have to learn from their errors. So I thought, okay, sign me up. And I won't go into the whole long story. I've written about it. I open Right Kind of Wrong with it. But what happened was I discovered that, it makes me laugh to think of it because it's so obvious, but I discovered that people don't actually like to speak up about errors. But more interesting than that was that in some groups, in some patient care teams, in the same hospitals, people in fact did do it, right? They were willing to do it. And so I initially characterized that difference in what I was calling interpersonal climate as sort of perceptions. Why do people perceive the interpersonal threat differently over here versus over here? My short answer was local leadership. The sort of the leaders in the middle, the nurse managers, the medical directors, the branch managers, the restaurant managers, store managers, people who are the kind of the proximal leader around here, the person I can see and interact with, very strongly influence the learning environment. And that's how I was speaking about it. It was like, how do we create a learning environment? Because if people can't speak up about error, not only do we not learn from them, but we can't catch and correct so that our processes are good and our outcomes are good. In the process of trying to get a subsequent paper published in an academic journal, a reviewer, a blind reviewer, we don't know who they are, suggested that what I was really talking about was psychological safety, which was a term in the literature, in the management literature, that hadn't gotten a lot of attention, but had been talked about in the 60s by Warren Bennis and Ed Schein. And that reviewer said, I think the descriptive factor you're talking about is really psychological safety, so you should use that term. And when a reviewer tells you to do something, you do it. So that's how that term sort of started to creep into my work. And I was very specific. I'm studying team psychological safety because my data were showing that this was a construct that very much lived at the group level, not at the organizational level. Like you couldn't ask, what's the psychological safety level at General Motors? It's not an answerable
Yeah.
question, but you could say
Yes.
this team at General Motors, and then you could answer it. And so I became fascinated by this phenomenon that this interpersonal climate factor, which research has gone on to show really does influence performance in a wide variety of contexts, how it could be, given that it was so different across groups, the question becomes how do we have to lead, and how do CEOs have to lead, and how do leaders all the way through have to lead so that we really can become learning teams and with learning environments.
I would like to ask you, Amy, is there is one of the misconceptions when it comes to psychological safety that is about being nice, is about being transparent and open and say good thing, about whatever is happening, which is not really what it's about. It's not really a driver for performance at all. That's not what we're intending to. And you used to say, it's about candor and learning, if I'm right. And why so many people get it wrong? And what is the risk of people as well? This is a question that we got from the community, from Elisa Silva, that she said, how do leaders prevent psychological safety from being used as an excuse for mediocrity, whilst in making the foundation for performance?
This is so important. It's been no end of frustration for me that the misconceptions, right? The various ways that people have either used psychological safety inaccurately or worse, used it as a weapon, right? That, you can't hold me accountable because then you take away my psychological safety. That's not so. Psychological safety is described as a belief that you can speak up with candor, with ideas, questions, concerns, mistakes, requests for help, dissenting views, without fear of punishment or humiliation. Right? It's not. I think if you really ponder that, you recognize immediately, first of all, that's not about being nice. Being nice in vernacular terms is usually don't say what you really think because it wouldn't be nice. Being nice is about face saving, and that is perfectly fine at your next dinner party. But that's not what we do at work because too much is at stake.
Because what we say in the foreground is often very different what is in the background, because our own perception, they are very different what we say.
It's like the cartoons that have the thought bubbles, and then the stated. And as long as there's a big gap between the thought bubbles and the stated words, that means low psychological safety. And that is a risk factor for an organization. And two giant risks. One type are the quality problems or failures that will happen because people didn't speak up in a timely way to help prevent them. The other big kind of failure is the failure to innovate, the failure to take the kinds of risks you need to take to venture into new ground and develop, new and desirable products and services. So when, I think when CEOs and others are hearing that, psychological safety used as a concept in tension with high performance, they need to push back and just, you can point people to the work, you can point them to the articles, you can offer your own definition, but think about it this way. Psychological safety describes an environment where learning and candor feel possible. And that is not the same as feeling comfortable. I happen to think that learning, and I try to keep doing as much of it as I can, is uncomfortable. Right? It means I didn't know something, or I'm deficient in some way. I want to fill in that gap. It's not comfortable, but it is necessary. And so many aspects of work and the workplace aren't supposed to be comfortable. Yes, they should be energizing. Yes, they should be helping us learn and grow and do things that together that we never could have done alone. But comfort, that's something you do later, maybe curl up and watch a good movie later, but that's comfortable.
I'm translating what you see and what you say in my experiences with leadership teams primarily. And I can tell you, one, how many times psychological safety has been left to interpretation to people. So people and leader taking their own stand interpretation, what does it mean? And they, unfortunately, as you said, they use it in a way that could be beneficial to them versus what is about. And the second thing, which is also equally so important, is the fact that without the opportunity for people to say what they really think openly and transparently, without the fear of repercussion, everything is going to happen only by compliance, and no commitment will ever happen, because commitment doesn't work, it doesn't happen, real commitment, if people do not really feel safe to say what they really think about it, right?
That's right. And safe doesn't mean comfortable. It means, freedom from danger. Safety is freedom from harm, not, freedom from discomfort. And I think that's really important. And like you, I have observed or studied many management teams, top management teams, where people are it's amazing because here they are, very senior, very experienced people, but they're not speaking the truth because there's just some deep belief that it's not really doable, right? So when they disagree with a planned acquisition or a planned hiring or a product launch, they kind of look around and, oh, no one else is disagreeing. They'll be holding back. And I worked with one team years ago where it did do an acquisition of another company, and it was a very bad decision. It was a huge business failure. And some months later, they got together with help and decided to do an exercise of going around, kind of a post-mortem, and
Right.
each person was asked to speak about what they did, any way they contributed to this outcome. And one executive who had been relatively new on the team when they made the decision said, "I have to apologize to all of you." I mean, he was emotional. He said, "This is on me, but I had grave concerns and I said nothing. Everyone else seemed to be enthusiastic and I did not speak up." And he said, and I'll never forget it, he said, "I didn't want to be the skunk at the picnic." Right? Now that's, and he said, and, so I let you down, right? And that I'm now partially causally responsible for this failure. Now, the skunk at the picnic, right? That is a mental model, and it is
It is.
so far off, right? If you have a different view, you're not a skunk. And by the way, this isn't a picnic, right? You're a valued colleague who has a different point of view. Nothing could be more important than that. And this isn't supposed to be a picnic. This is supposed to be, a thoughtful and informed debate about a high stakes decision.
Such a great story. By the way, what is underpinning what you said is the level of authenticity, which also missing most of the time in organizations. So to me, there are two sides of the same coin, because being authentic requires something personally, So taking a stake of being real with yourself, and again, especially at least my experience, the higher you go in an organization, the less authenticity, unfortunately, you experience, because this sort of either sometimes unwillingness to be yourself and hiding a mask, either consciously or unconsciously, then prevails.
I do worry sometimes that people like psychological safety with all its ambiguity. The term "be yourself" also gets misunderstood. Be yourself isn't necessarily let it all hang out, right? Share whatever comes into your head. Be personal and open about various aspects of your life. No, it's being willing to express what Chris Argyris would call work relevant thoughts, feelings, but they ought to be at least arguably work relevant, right? I don't think this acquisition is a good idea because I worry about that hire.
In the context of the business and the environment they're dealing with.
It's always helpful to keep doubling down on the goals, doubling down on the ambition. What is it we're trying to do? And what's it going to take to get there? And one of the answers to what's it going to take to get there will nearly always be truth telling, idea sharing, risk taking. You can't really get there without that kind of environment.
Another question, or another important topic to me, especially with the audience that people that are listening, watching this episode, is people that are really sitting at the top table. And for many of them right now, which by the way, I don't think is something new, but clearly the level of uncertainty, the level of pressure is increasing right now due to the volatility, due to all the trends, and you are well aware of. So one typical I wouldn't say objection, but one question that is really top of mind of leaders or people that are working with these leaders is how can we protect that psychological safety, for example, when the pressure is really at the highest level, where people feel like, okay, we don't have time to that, or we need to make good decision regardless what we're really thinking about. That is a critical element that I think is worth, taking your view about it.
It is not new that we're facing uncertainty, but it is absolutely intensified. Right? It's accelerated. It's bordering on chaotic. But that is neither an excuse for nor a rationale for eschewing high quality conversations. In fact, it means we need to have high quality conversations more than ever. And a fundamental misconception around psychological safety and high quality conversations is that will take more time. In reality, I cannot tell you how many senior teams I've studied where they ate up oodles of time not talking directly about the real issues, and certain strategy meetings that would go on for months because they couldn't talk. The thought bubbles just kept dominating. They couldn't talk straight. And I can also say I have seen many conversations, high quality conversations, straight talk that were quite efficient. Right. So it's actually a misconception that it will take longer. It will take more skill for sure. It will take more discipline, but it will not take longer to engage in. Let me define a high quality conversation, right? It's one where everyone participating is engaged. You're not on your phone, but you're either speaking or listening. Number 2, there's a healthy mix of questions and statements. And number 3, there's a sense that we're getting smarter. We're getting closer to some kind of resolution or better decision than we had at the beginning. So that's pretty aspirational, but it seems like a good aspiration to hold to. So do not use the lack of time and the speed of change as an excuse for not engaging in high quality conversations. I just think that's a major mistake. And do call attention to the fact that, especially in these kind of challenging times, we lack a crystal ball. We really don't have a glimpse of the future. So that puts the premium even higher on, going around the table to say, what do we know? What do we not know? What might we be missing altogether? And let's just make sure we do that as effectively, with as much discipline and candor as possible, so that we can make a quick and smart decision, not a quick and stupid decision.
Yeah, totally. And unfortunately, yet we see a lot of leaders during moment of stress and pressure. They tend to, so the first kind of a conversation they kill is exactly what you're saying, right? So they prefer, it's all about strategy, it's taking action. So it's all a conversation that's useful, but not necessarily the one that they need in that specific time. The other thing I also observe, that's my personal view, is when the level of, so if I look more from a psychological perspective, when people feel a lot of stress and pressure, and now we're talking about top leaders, what normally get instigated is your personal protection, meaning your defense mechanism, right? Your defense mechanism that kicks in because that's the way, first of all, I need to be saved as a person. So, right. And that's normally is unfortunately a constraint limitation to be open and transparent because you are only focusing on preserving yourself, which is a human condition, which is a part of the human nature, right?
Yes, it's so important, right? I mean, I don't have a magic wand that I could share and say we could disconnect that relationship between stress and the amygdala and, the fear response, and then the spontaneous self-protection. And the self-protective response will lead me to hold back, not lean in, right? So, but what we do have is the opportunity to talk about it, right? To make that, instead of a private hell, we can make it a shared challenge, right? Given that under times of extreme stress, we are at risk for reverting to what Chris Argyris might call defensive routines or self-protection. Given that, together we're going to have to find ways to overcome it. That's a team sport, right? It will, because privately we're all going to be at risk. So in a shared way, we can almost laugh about it. We can say,
Yes.
let's arrest the fear-based stress response right in its tracks and just act as if we feel confident sharing our thoughts. Let's fake it till we make it.
Totally. And the team can become the defensive mechanism. So versus activating your own personal individual mechanism, you can actually leverage the team to provide the level of safety that you need in that current condition.
And the team can buffer you. The team can be a buffer against that chaos that's out there. Like within these, in this room, within these walls, we're going to do something rather unusual. We're going to talk straight. We're going to raise risks. We're going to, by the way, be willing to reach closure in a timely way, even without certainty, but we are going to hope that it's going to be as good as possible, right? I like to say that in an uncertain world, your success depends on high quality bets. You might not like the word bets, but make no mistake, they are bets, that decisions, etc. You're making a bet, so please try to make a good one.
Let's move a little bit more on failure and learning, which is an area that is always, it all started from learning and then your interest in how people react to failures. And I remember that you talk about the difference between blameworthy failures and intelligent failures. I'm so interested to hear more about that.
Right.
And why it's so hard for leaders to make that discipline, the distinction in practice.
I think it goes back to these emotional, almost automatic responses that we've been talking about. And most of us from the time of elementary school, learned an almost instinctive response to failure. We don't want to fail. We want to succeed. We want to be right, not wrong. We want to look good, not bad. And so we're then at risk of failing to make the distinctions we need to make to have the kinds of failures from which we get innovations, but to not have the kinds of failures that are sources of quality problems and are fundamentally preventable. So I'll say a little more about blameworthy in a moment, but the real distinction is between preventable and unpreventable. And preventable failures are the kinds of failures that happen when we have a formula, we have a good manufacturing process, for example, but someone wasn't paying attention, didn't follow, or someone checked the wrong box in an online form, led to a nearly catastrophic transfer of funds that shouldn't have happened. Similarly, that story we were talking about before, where a senior executive did not speak up with his concerns about an acquisition, that was a preventable failure. Now, if he had been the only one, if he was the only one with concerns and he hadn't been on the team, then we could say, okay, it wasn't preventable. But given his presence, it was preventable. So I am all about, I'm enthusiastic about preventing preventable failures, right? I think they're wasteful. Like if you have smart people in your organization who could have told you don't do that and you do it, shame on you, right? So you're to blame in a sense. Even though we have this allergy, this emotional reaction to failure, we need to learn to fall in love with the kinds of failures that bring us new information, especially the kind of information we couldn't have gotten any other way, right? The trial and failure. You must, if you don't know what will work, you're a scientist in a lab, you have no choice. You have to experiment. Good scientists at the top of their field, Nobel Prize winning scientists, will tell you, depending on the field, they fail anywhere between 70 and 90% of the time, right? Which sounds devastating, but of course the 10% or the 20% are pretty exciting, and that's how they. So my passion about failure is that when we can train our brains and our teams to distinguish between the kinds of thoughtful experiments or thoughtful risk-taking that bring us closer to sought-after goals and the kind that come from sloppiness or inadequate training or inadequate management, then we're much better poised for excellence in both domains.
It's a great distinction, which not necessarily people are fully aware of. Because I think there is a unique dimension that is given to failure and then doesn't really allow people to understand what actually is their responsibility inside of that and what could be leadership. Because leadership is intervening, and take a responsibility of what is missing or what is not working. So we got a couple of questions. So as I said to
Okay.
you before we started this conversation, so we posted on LinkedIn and we asked people to ask questions to you, and people have been very generous to send me more than 30, 40 questions. I don't know how many. So on failure learning, there were a couple of questions that people ask. So one is Harvey Lee. He said, how can leaders champion intelligent failure and learning when they're under intense pressure to deliver predictable short-term results, which is
Yeah.
connected to what we said before. And
Yep.
then Elisa Silva again, she asking, how do you present organization from failing into failure theater, where every mistake gets
Ah,
rebranded as
yeah.
learning without real accountability? That's such a great question.
Yeah, it is. Ooh, failure theater. I love that, Louisa. I'm gonna use that one. It's kind of it's sham learning rather than real learning. And I do think this is a leadership responsibility. I mean, leaders must model learning. They must model the humility of being clear about the fact they don't have a crystal ball. But my flippant response to the first question of how can leaders sort of promote, encourage intelligent failure in times of great, champion intelligent failure in times of great pressure and stress, my short answer is how can they not, right? Because in times of real pressure and stress, innovation is more at a premium than ever before. So you need to solve problems. You need to find solutions to new challenges.
Exactly.
Therefore, you need to innovate. Therefore, you need to fail. You cannot. No one ever innovated without failure. Failure is a clear stepping stone on the path to innovation. So the way they have to do that then, since it's a responsibility, is just to be crystal clear about what that means. And for example, intelligent failure, it's not just, okay, you failed, so let's call it intelligent and be off the hook. It's an intelligent failure needs to be in new territory, in pursuit of a goal, with a hypothesis, with some reason to believe this could work, and as small as possible. Just big enough to get the new information. You don't bet your entire budget on an uncertain outcome. You don't launch an uncertain product at scale. You pilot, you test. And so this is about getting people in the business. It's agile, really, getting them in the business of small, smart, reversible tests, frequent, early and often, so that we're fine together, sharing the information widely. Together, we're going to find what works. And because of the pressure we're under, we're all the more motivated and in need of doing it. Failure theater, the best defense against a failure theater is straight talk. It's being willing to sort of be discerning enough that, if people are starting to just play games with this, let's talk about it. Let's make it discussable. Let's be super clear on when we really are hitting those 4 criteria, new territory in pursuit of a goal with a hypothesis as small as possible.
I agree. And it goes back to the point that we both made in terms of responsibility, because I can see the power and the validity of this question, meaning, yes, great, let's celebrate failure, let's declare that we failed, etc. But then nothing really happens afterward. So I think that's what she's pointing to, right? Is a theater of celebration of failure, but not accountability for making things differ, right?
There's a 5th criterion, I guess, which is you really learn from it and you use those lessons, you share them, and you use them to design the next step. It's more of a failure is not an end, it's a beginning. Each failure is giving us some valuable information about what we should be trying next.
Totally right. All right. The other thing is the other topic that came up in the conversation with people on LinkedIn, and I think they all, not all, but many people, they pointed to the same direction, which is a word taken here in the final part of this conversation. It's about repairing safety, meaning, and we agree that safety can feel fragile, right? That's how we at least.
It's asymmetrical anyway. It's easier to harm than to build.
So one bad experience can, and we know, and trust erodes. Trust has been there for many years, right? So before getting to the other question that people ask, in terms of the fragility of safety, what do you think is the smartest way for leaders to rebuild psychological safety after it's been broken? Because again, that is a common point in the question that I received.
In some form or another, it starts with an apology, or there will be an apology. Even if an apology is something that just acknowledges the gap, right? Acknowledges that something was harmed, something that
Right.
we had a setback. Just to name, first of all, name that, make it discussable. Like, oh, that was, that was disappointing, or that was hard, or that was not what I intended. So, and sort of express both a commitment going forward to doing better, and that can be individual or shared, and to own your part in it, right? Whether, no matter how small, whether omission or commission, that it's being willing to say, I should have asked for your thoughts rather than waiting for you to speak up, let's say, about that, that failed acquisition, right? That when the leader is willing to say, I can see how I contributed to that deficit. And often, the deficit, a psychological safety setback often happens because someone gets angry, and because they're human and they hear bad news, and they don't mean to kill the psychological safety or the direct reporting, but they're upset, and that upsetness reverberates. But it's okay. You're human. That will happen. What isn't okay is not to make it discussable. Let's talk about it. We're human. Let's resolve to do better, because it's a mess. There's a challenging path ahead.
I agree. It starts with an apology. But would you agree with at least my observation that the trust level in organization at the moment is at the minimum, especially at the top leadership level?
Yes. I mean, I think there's enormous fear at the top leadership level. There's fear of the external environment. There's fear of saying things even internally that might come back to haunt you. I think there's a worry that is also exacerbated by our social media rich environment, which kind of suggests accurately that almost anything you say and do can sort of show up somewhere else out of context, or maybe not even out of context. There's never been a more fraught environment out there, an environment that almost feels more risky, right? That feels like that risk taking is just not something I can do right now. And yet, to not be able and willing to take the risks, especially the risks of candor, is an even bigger risk, right? Because
Yes.
that puts us at risk of certain failure down the line.
Yeah, 100%. And by the way, right now, given a time of uncertainty, the more you're able, you and your team, to start looking at the future and what potentially could happen, the better it is. So never been a better time actually
That's right.
to really apply what you said. So I have a couple of final questions, Amy, for you, more looking about the future now. So if you think about the next 10 years of work, our work, business, society in general, how do you think must leaders evolve? How must leaders really evolve beyond psychological safety? Meaning, what's the next frontier? What's coming next in the human system space?
I think systems thinking is coming to the forefront. I have a single chapter in Right Kind of Wrong about the competency to think more systemically. And it's not enough. There's, great work out there by many people for whom this is their expertise.
Well, you mentioned Peter Senge. I mean, it's been the number one on systemic thinking. It's been years ago, yet that is still not happening in many organizations.
Somewhat like psychological safety, it hasn't changed the world because it's actually so hard for us. Our brains are reasonably hardwired to be about here and now and me, not to be about us, downstream consequences, the bigger picture, we see parts, not relationships. We need to train ourselves to see the relationships between parts, because those ultimately are determining the results we get. So the simple discipline to pause and say who and what else is affected by this decision, what unintended downstream consequences might it produce? It doesn't seem like a lot to ask, and yet it doesn't happen naturally. So I think we need to get more sophisticated and more emotionally capable of systems thinking, because we are operating in some very complex, very interdependent, and in some cases very error-prone or failure-prone systems.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, I'm so glad that you said that, because to me, the higher is the complexity, the bigger the chance will be for people to default or their individual role, accountability, responsibility, and themselves. Really, their own self will prevail in a very complex environment.
It's that self-protection again, that instinct to self-protection, which is
Yes.
very powerful and very, at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid, right? It's just kind
Yeah.
of my
Exactly.
basic need for security. And so that's understandable, and it will kill us. If each of us is about me and now, we won't make it. Our organizations will fail. Our society will be in trouble.
Which is the reason why I believe most of the CEOs, they really keep simplicity at the top of their agenda, because simplicity will kill or fight complexity, so people will not exactly go back in their default state that you just described. So such a great point. Finally, last question for you, Amy. If you could leave every CEO in the audience today, CEO is a top leader, so in listening, with one challenge for tomorrow morning, what would it be? So what need to focus on? What you really want to lead them with?
It's double down on the value proposition, right? It's double down. It's the simplicity that you just mentioned made me think of this, but it's always, start with why, start with purpose, lead with who are we and what are we trying to do? And then immediately after, so that the stage setting that I think every CEO needs to do on a daily basis is reinforce the purpose and call attention to the context. And by context, I really mean the degree of uncertainty, novelty, complexity, and the stakes. What's at stake? Because you're trying to harness, the leader's job is to harness the hearts and minds of others so that they will willingly work hard and together, overcoming interpersonal risk, to do challenging things. And people are willing to sign up to do that, but only if you're signing up in a way that shows them, that makes it feel worth it, that really does capture hearts and minds. So double down on purpose and call attention to the context every day.
Yeah, because if you shift the context, you can help people to see something different. So what we discussed the last 45 minutes will not potentially be top of their mind because they started to see something different from themselves. And if I can one thing I would add, building what you said, I would say integrity. So do exactly what you say. So showing your integrity, because that's what people are probably what they need right now.
Absolutely. And when you fall short, apologize, because you will, because you're human. But that's okay. I mean,
Exactly.
you mean well, and just get back on it.
Fantastic. Amy, thank you so much for being on the episode and on the show today. I mean, so many great things you share as expected. Is there anything you would like to leave the audience with? Anything about you, your work, your research?
No, I think this has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate the chance to meet with you on this.
Thank you so much, Amy.